A very warm welcome, viewers, in the program Halate Hazra with Dr. Tahir. About 2 months ago, I interviewed Professor Julian Richards about Ukraine-Russia war, and I asked several questions about the general overview of war in Ukraine, root causes of this conflict, and the role of Nato, and the likely outcome of this crisis. While still this war is going on, and the world is very much affected by this war. Therefore, it is essential to take a brief analysis of the current situation, current status of war in Ukraine, and how the things moving forward. I'm really thankful to Professor Julian Richards that he accepted my request second time for an interview. Professor Julian Richards is Associate Dean at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Director at the Center for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Your tie is very beautiful, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please, nearly 4 months after Russian invasion, could you briefly analyze the current status of war in Ukraine for my viewers?
Yes, of course, and it's quite a lot has happened over that period since we last spoke. So last time we spoke, this was a relatively new invasion. We were starting to get the first impressions of how it might go. Many of us, as with every conflict, hoped it would be a relatively short situation. But it's significantly changed its character and its status in the intervening weeks and months, and is now settling into, as we predicted, I think last time, into a much longer and more protracted conflict that's likely to continue certainly through the rest of this year, and I suspect into next year as well. Key things that have happened. One is that the Russian strategy has changed quite significantly in this period that we've seen. So the initial fairly comprehensive plan to invade Ukraine and to unseat the government and to effectively take over and install a sympathetic government in Kiev, that proved to be something of a disaster for the Russian military forces. They encountered much stiffer resistance than they were expecting. They realised that they had all sorts of supply chain problems. The assistance that the West gave to the Ukrainian forces was bigger and more effective than the Russians had anticipated, I suspect. So what they've done is significantly change their strategy to retrench and concentrate very much on the eastern part of Ukraine, what we call the Donbass region, and to double down on that region and consolidate gains there, and to effectively carve off a big chunk of eastern Ukraine. There's also the time lapse between the initial invasion and now has allowed them to resupply, to re-strategize. The area that they're focusing now is adjacent to the Russian border, so the supply chain issues are easier for Russia effectively. It hasn't got these long and vulnerable supply chains across Ukrainian territory. So the bad news is that this means that the Russian forces are digging in for a much longer and more difficult period of conflict. It's going to be much more difficult to push them back from now on. The more promising news is, which we'll I'm sure come on to in a moment, is that the Western approach, particularly NATO's approach to it, is changing quite significantly at the moment, and I think this is quite a pivotal.
I asked a separate question about the NATO's position.
Sure, we'll come on to that. But I think it's a pivotal moment now where we've passed from the initial phase of the conflict into a second and much longer and more difficult phase, effectively.
Yeah. A NATO chief warned that war in Ukraine could last for years. Please, can I ask you how long this was likely to last?
Well, at one level it could last for years, because we have to remember that the the Russian support for the militia groups in the Donbass region, the pro-Russian militia groups there, has been going on for a long time, actually, really to a significant degree since 2014. So a certain level of conflict in that part of Ukraine has already been going on for years, and it could continue at this relatively focused level, potentially for 2 or 3 more years. I think the reasons why that might not be the case are that the growing alliance of and resolve in Nato, for example, that wishes to bring this to an end in a way that they perhaps tolerated a low level of conflict in eastern Ukraine before. I think we're moving to a stage where they're not going to tolerate this so much, partly because of the effects of this conflict on the global economy and so on, which again we'll come on to, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's the question.
So I think it's like I say, it's entering an interesting new phase. At some point this has to end. This has to end with some agreement or acceptable situation for all parties. It's hard to see what that looks like at the moment. Russia has shown that it's absolutely not willing to compromise or step back. Every day almost they show that they're prepared to not budge 1 inch really from their position that they've held in recent times. We saw last night a terrible missile attack on a civilian shopping centre. So they're not really budging at all on their position. And the West and NATO is not budging either. They're also talk of compromises and negotiations has very much gone out of the window at the moment. It's becoming much more talk of military confrontation. So I think that unfortunately means this could grind on for quite a long period, possibly years. But of course we all hope that we can reach some sort of resolution of this within the next year or so.
Next 2 years. Yeah. Do you think that President Putin, he underestimated the resistance capacity of Ukraine?
Yes, I think he certainly did, and he perhaps took as the precedent what didn't happen when he annexed the Crimea in 2014. Apart from some grumbling in Western capitals, some minor talk of possible sanctions, not much happened really, to be honest. And he took that as a remit to push it a bit further. But I think he will have been very surprised by the very stiff resistance that he's faced. And we have to give credit to the Ukrainian forces, first of all, for being very resolute and very determined to push back against the Russian aggressor. But we also, it's notable how much support NATO has given to the Ukrainians. It still doesn't go anything like far enough as far as Ukraine is concerned. But there has been very significant material support given in the supply of anti-tank weaponry.
I'm coming on that side. Yeah.
So I think, yes, I think Putin did miscalculate, and that's caused him to have to rethink his strategy and to concentrate on this eastern portion of the region rather than the bigger pan-Ukrainian vision that he obviously had at the beginning.
Yeah. Please, can I ask you, at the moment, what is the NATO's position in Ukraine war? Because at the beginning of this conflict, the NATO countries, they were very much clear they will not physically intervene in this war. However, they will provide diplomatic support, financial support, weapons, but they will not physically intervene in this. So still the NATO countries, they are stand on their same position, and they will change.
Yes, at one level, nothing has changed. NATO is still repeatedly saying we have no intention of intervening physically in this conflict because that would escalate it significantly, probably. Ukraine isn't a NATO country, and also NATO is essentially a defensive alliance. NATO is not an aggressive power, it's a defensive power. So until Russia directly attacks or threatens NATO countries, NATO is not minded to become physically involved. However, with that said, and of course we're speaking on the day of a very significant NATO summit that's about to commence in Madrid in Spain, There's a shift in the rhetoric and the attitude in NATO that's very significant potentially. We're now starting to see talk of ramping up military capability. There's already a commitment to position a emergency defensive force around Ukraine's borders, numbering 300,000 troops, which is a very significant force. Not yet to use those troops, but to position them as a potential deterrent and a message to Putin. There's talk of increasing defence spending quite significantly across NATO member countries, including from countries like Germany, which previously have been fairly recalcitrant, fairly unwilling to get to they have a very low level of defence spending, and within NATO countries they're now talking much tougher about this and more resolutely about this. And interestingly, today we saw a very significant statement by the new incoming Chief of the Army in the UK, Sir Patrick Sanders, who said this is starting to look a bit like the 1930s. He said this is a 1937 moment. And by that, what he meant is that in the 1930s, the Nazis were rising in Germany. We started to realise that war, big all-out war, was becoming a very real possibility. And of course, if you're going to get involved in a big war, you have to prepare for that. You have to start ramping up for that over a period. So on the one hand, NATO isn't shifting from its position of not wanting to cause a huge escalation here in Ukraine. We're not at that stage yet. But on the other hand, the narrative and the rhetoric is shifting slightly, is starting to become a little bit more resolute. And of course, the other significant thing with NATO is that we've seen Finland and Sweden apply to join NATO, which is a very, very significant development. Two previously neutral countries now resolutely wanting to join into the NATO alliance and bolster it. They haven't been made members yet because of resistance by Turkey. But these are significant developments that mean NATO might be moving in a different direction.
It's very interesting, but I would like to just ask you some question, because you said that NATO basically is a defensive force. And can I ask you that the NATO attacked on Iraq and Libya? I'm not talking about Afghanistan, that's a different situation. But when they attacked on Iraq and Libya, what was defensive position that time here? The preemptive attack because President Saddam, he had weapons of mass destructions, and he had just 634 different locations where he hid the weapons of mass destruction. But after that, and there's so many literature now available. This is totally wrong. There was nothing in the weapons of mass destruction. So it was NATO's defensive position that time, and even on the Libya, when he just withdraw all their Colonel Gaddafi, that all their atomic technology, and give up, that he will not just move forward with the atomic. So do you think that this is a double standard of NATO, and that side is never as a defensive force, but here in the case of Ukraine and Russia, because Russia is a big military power, so that's why I'm sorry to say, sir, that you say that NATO is a defensive force.
Yes, and don't be sorry, Mohammed. The immediate answer to your question is yes, these are double standards, and that's the world can see that.
Yeah.
It's difficult to argue otherwise, really. However, as I said last time, these are different. All of these cases are slightly different, and there are slightly different conditions that surrounded them. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a degree of hypocrisy, of course. And many observers in the world will have spotted that, really. But I think in the case of Iraq, that the significant factors there were, firstly, it was connected to the 9/11 attacks, essentially.
Yeah.
And 9/11 is the only time that NATO has ever invoked Article 5, which is the mutual defence element in its treaty.
Yeah.
So the 9/11 attacks caused Article 5 to be triggered, which led to a comprehensive campaign to fight back against Al-Qaeda. Now you might say, well, what did Saddam Hussein have to do with Al-Qaeda? Now the politics at the time made a connection between the two forces. So a connection that we kind of knew at the time and now definitely know was erroneous. But at the time the calculation was that a rogue nation like Iraq, with a history of not only having weapons of mass destruction but actually using them. You remember they used chemical weapons against Kurdish minorities in the north of Iraq in the past. A sense that the new dangerous post 9/11 world was one in which a rogue state of that nature couldn't be allowed to continue, basically. Now this is the politics of it. I'm not saying this was right or correct at the time. The other significant point is that NATO applied for, they did discuss this in the United Nations General Assembly. Now there's debate, and you, Mohammed, being a lawyer previously, will know that there's a lot of legal debate about whether they had a legal justification to go into Iraq. I think the legal case was pretty frail, really, and much different from 1991 when the Allies attacked Iraq after the Kuwait invasion. But the 9/11 factor was significant there. Now remember, many people in the West, particularly in the UK, absolutely opposed that war and saw it as an illegal intervention. There was a huge demonstration against.
Yeah, huge demonstration. There are more than 1 million people. They just
Now, of course, that doesn't help now in trying to convince people that these are not hypocritical positions, perhaps. But it's worth teasing out those factors that were significant at that time. Libya, again, slightly different in a sense, in that the legal or supposedly legal justification for the Libyan intervention was articles in the laws of armed conflict that said if a genocide is likely to happen, you can take military action to prevent the genocide happening. And at the time the justification was that Colonel Gaddafi was about to commit a fairly repressive attack against some rebel forces that had risen up against him in the west of the country, the east of the country rather. Now again, legally you could say that was a slightly frail justification, and why did that apply then and hasn't applied in numerous other cases? So you know, I can't disagree with you really that there is some of these positions are hypocritical, and of course taking on Libya militarily is very different from taking on Russia militarily. So that is indeed one of the key reasons why it's different. I will say in NATO's defence that it is the case that if we did get into a big conflict with Russia at the moment, the consequences of that could be very, very serious. Not for everyone on the planet, basically. In fact, we're already seeing that the Ukrainian conflict is disrupting the global economy very significantly, with very grave implications for many parts of the world. So there is justification in not wanting to escalate this massively and any sooner than we absolutely have to. So you know, not every case is the same, I suppose, is what NATO is saying, and that the implications of things might be different at different times. But you know, at the end of the day, yes, these are. It's difficult to avoid the charge of double standards.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and we can ask and discuss too long about Iraq and Libya, but. Today our main topic is Ukraine-Russia war, so that's why I will just focus on this one here. The United Nations Secretary General warned world food shortage because of war in Ukraine, and you know that already there's energy crisis in the world and increasing oil prices, and countries around the globe, they are facing very high inflations. Please can I ask you that how this conflict is affecting the global economy?
Yes, and of course it should be noted that the war comes on the back of a couple of other very significant developments in recent years that have created a perfect storm of disruption to the world economy. and particularly, of course, the COVID crisis. So the global economy hadn't recovered from the very severe supply chain disruptions from the COVID crisis before this war commenced. So it would have had a very disruptive effect anyway, but it has a doubly disruptive effect now when it comes on the back of an already very disrupted global economy. So the consequences are very grave, particularly in two areas, particularly in oil and gas supply and prices. Those were already going up anyway, but the war has caused those to sharply accelerate. And of course, oil and gas and energy is so central to all industrial activity, all economic activity really, that any significant spike in prices for oil and gas leads to massive inflation in other sectors of economies, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. So that's extremely significant, and it's not something that can be remedied quickly or easily. If you're receiving oil through a pipeline, you can't very quickly switch to receiving it another way, or not without significantly increasing your costs, basically. So that's a factor there. The grain implication perhaps hadn't been anticipated by many people who weren't experts in this sort of field, but we now discover that the proportion of global grain that comes from Ukraine is really significant, much higher than many of us realised, in fact. And of course the disruption of that is causing very significant implications for inflation in many parts of the world. The United Nations is warning of a global famine as being a possibility that comes out of this. And again, grain is not something you can quickly switch. You have a certain number of harvests per year, maybe 2 harvests per year. You can't suddenly generate grain from other places very quickly. There are moves to change the distribution of grain out of Ukraine rather than south through the Black Sea route, to go north across land to Poland and thereafter off to other parts of the world. But that significantly increased costs, which again leads to inflation, which leads to economic collapse. So I think the combination of factors here, that the war is almost like a last nail in the coffin of an already very struggling global economy. And the significance, which will be felt differently in different places. I mean, you'll know, Mohammed, that in Pakistan and one or two other places, the inflation rates are really significant, and the implications on food supply are very, very grave indeed. So people here in the UK are complaining about inflation, but we're not yet in the sorts of difficulties that some other countries around the world are.
This is my other question.
So very significant, very worrying, and of course that adds to the general pressure to find a resolution to this situation and not to just let it carry on for years, because it's hard to see how the global economy could survive that situation, really.
Viewers, we will continue a very interesting discussion with Professor Julian Richard, and see you soon. Thank you very much.